Well, before we come around the Lord's table, the Lord's Supper, time of communion, let's open up our Bibles and turn to Hebrews chapter 10. We've been in Hebrews 10 the last few weeks, and I want to pick right back up from where we left off last week. If you notice in the bulletin, this is part 2 of what we discussed and began last week, and it's a discussion on apostasy and apostates. This is where we are in the text. An apostate, you'll remember, is someone who once said they believed, once said that they trusted in Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, but now they don't. They no longer believe. They no longer trust. That's what an apostate is. An apostate is one who's rejected Christ. An apostate is someone who's rejected the gospel. Ultimately, an apostate is someone who has rejected the Bible as the Word of God. It's a complete rejection and refusal of all that Christ has offered them in Christ Jesus. And there's a number of examples in the Bible of apostates. You remember in Jude, he refers to those who went the way of Cain. You could say Cain was the first apostate. And on the heels of that, he adds in the error of Balaam. Sometimes we don't add or think about adding Balaam to the list of apostates, but Balaam's an apostate. So in the Old Testament, you have Cain, you have Balaam. I think you could add King Saul to that list. In the New Testament, I read your 1 Timothy 1, and there in verse 20, Paul mentions Hymenaeus and Alexander as a couple that became apostate. Later, Paul refers to Demas, who loved this world and went out as an apostate. There's a number of other so-called apostates in the Bible, but certainly throughout church history. Sadly, I know of a number of them myself personally. The consequences for such apostates, you can read there in verses 26 to 31, which we'll do in a moment. Apostasy, then. If that's what an apostate is someone who refuses and rejects Christ. What's apostasy? Well, apostasy is just the act of refusing and rejecting Christ. The Bible actually gives a number of pictures or word descriptions of someone who once believed and rejected. Words like departing, withdrawing, turning away, defecting, denying, falling away, walking away, suffering shipwreck. We saw that in 1 Timothy 1. And then, if you drop down to verse 32 of chapter 10, he talks about those who shrinking back. But in verse 26, we actually have another way of describing apostasy. And I never really thought about this. But if you notice in verse 26, it says, "For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth." Just stop there for a moment. If we go on sinning willfully, then that's a bit of a different approach to the subject of apostasy or the description of apostasy, because falling away, shrinking back, turning away, that kind of points to the outcome. I mean, we can observe that. But the beginning of it all, and on the inside, is this: sinning willfully. This is where it all begins. Sometimes we don't observe that. Sometimes that's done privately, in private closets. Somebody placed apart for a long time, knows the language, and puts on the spiritual hat. But in his heart of hearts, he's sinning willfully. This is just a rejection of where the writer is at in this letter. He's basically saying sinning willfully is just a rejection of everything he's just said. There are those who have actually rejected Christ as high priest, as mediator, and they do it willfully. The NIV, and I'm also reading the Legacy Standard Bible, translates it, "if we deliberately or willfully keep on sinning." And the idea behind that is it's in the present tense, that it's a continuous action. It isn't just a one-time of, it's ongoing. And the word willfully can be translated deliberately, voluntarily, intentionally. And the point is there's no outside force upon them to sin. They're doing it on their own. Willfully, by the way, stands at the front of the sentence. If you're going to translate it literally from the Greek, willfully is the very first word. And word order is always for the emphatic purposes. Whatever word's up front is usually to indicate that this is the emphasis. For if you go on sinning willfully, or willfully if you go on sinning, then there's consequences for that. Do you remember the verses right before that says, hey, I've got some exhortations for you. I want you to draw near, I want you to hold fast, and I want you to help others to hold fast. Because if you don't do those three, and you go on sinning willfully, here are the consequences. Going on sinning willfully is another word for apostasy. If you apostatize, here's what's coming. And you say, well, what's that? Well, look at it. He says, if you go on, or if we, he's putting himself in there, go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth. So you've come to the knowledge of the truth. But somewhere, at some time, you started drifting, you started rejecting it, willfully, sinning against it. What are the consequences for that? Well, he says, end of verse 26, therefore, read it with me, no longer remains the sacrifice for sins, but a terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has regarded as defiled the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has insulted the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. And again, the Lord will judge his people. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Apostasy is no mere trivial thing. It's one thing being an unbeliever and never hearing the gospel and never accepting it. You'll be judged for that. You'll be judged for your sins. But for someone to have, quote unquote, believed, who have understood the truth and have accepted for whatever period of time, and then willfully sinning against it, willfully rejecting it, he says it, how much worse the judgment. It would have been better if you've never believed. It would have been better if you've never heard. One way to avoid apostasy is to talk about apostasy. That's why the warnings are here. Remember last week when we introduced this, this is the 4th of 5 warnings. He sprinkles warnings throughout his letter just to remind them that Christ is the answer. Christ is who you look upon. You got to head forward. You got to progress forward. Christ, Christ, Christ. But if you reject Christ, there's consequences. And as I said, this is the 4th. Now, who he's talking about is unbelievers, but who he's talking to is believers. You understand that? These warnings are for you, the Christian. They are the means of grace for you to progress. Because as you read that, there's something inside of you that says, oh, I don't want to apostatize, right? There's something inside of you that says, you know what, maybe I better examine my life. Am I drifting? Am I exercising the means of grace? It's like the road. I think I mentioned this last week. It's like you're driving down the road, and at the end of the road, there's this sharp right turn, and if you're not prepared for it, you're going to go straight and right off the cliff. So it would help to have a sign that says, slow down, right turn ahead. That's what this warning is. This is a sign. It's a road sign that says, beware, be cautious. It's interesting, by the way, that when you read a number of commentaries, modern commentaries, I should say, the last couple hundred years, on this text, each one of them refers to Jonathan Edwards and his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. You remember that? Now, Edwards didn't preach it from this text. He preached it from a text in Deuteronomy, but you end up in the same place, just putting the fear of God into people and the fear of not apostatizing. Let me just remind you of something Edwards said in here, which sounds very similar to what the writer of Hebrews is saying. He says, and this is in his sermon, the Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. He says, the bow of God's wrath is bent, and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice bends the arrow at your heart and strains the bow, and it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God, and that of an angry God, without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood. Now, obviously, Edwards wasn't on a popularity contest when he preached that, but he's absolutely right. And you ask, where are the preachers of that today? We need to hear that. The unbeliever needs to hear that one day they will meet God, and they better be prepared. And don't go meeting God without a mediator, is the message. I mean, that sounds like the very last verse there in verse 31. It is a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Maybe we should all just stop and just meditate on that for a moment. There is a living God, a God that made the heavens and the earth and the seas and made us. And he is living. He's still in control. And the question is, do you want to fall into the hands of him? But as I said, this willfully sinning, that's the beginning. The going away, the walking away, the defecting, the denying, however you want to describe apostasy, that's the end. They were with us, but they are no longer here because they've gone out. So they're gone. We saw them walk out the door. But where did it all begin? How did it all begin? That to me is I ask that question because I don't understand. I mean, I understand and I don't understand. I understand that that's the heart of man. Sure. But the idea of rejecting Christ and rejecting salvation, the beauty of Christ, the glory of Christ, the gospel, what you really want to fall into the hands of an angry living God? That's the question I have. So pulling back a bit from the text, where we started last week and where I want to pick up this morning is just the whole subject of the phenomenon of apostasy. The phenomenon of apostasy. Why do they do it? How do they do it? You know, some of the general reasons out there were, well, I read science books. I read evolution, and, you know, I saw what the science said about creation, and I read the Bible, and it just doesn't work for me. Science trumps the Bible. So there might be some intellectual reasons that made them walk out the door. Maybe there's some rational arguments as well, or as I mentioned last week, hypocritical reasons. Maybe your mom and your dad are just absolute hypocrites, and you think, well, how can I believe in a Savior when I don't even see a saved life? There could be a number of reasons why people walk out the door. And so I just jotted down a few that I could think of. Remember, we started a little list. I came up with 11. 11 catalysts, possible causes of apostasy. I think we only got through 2 or 3, so I'll do those quickly and then pick up where I left off. And I think this would be a good way of leading into the Lord's Supper, because I think this would be a good time of self-examination with each one of these. The first one, again, we're talking about why would somebody apostatize, and how did it all begin? I mean, by the way, before I begin, Unbelief at the end of the day is the reason why, right? Let's make sure at the end of the day, somebody that willfully deliberately sins equals unbelief. They do not believe anymore. But what started that drift, so to speak? First thing I thought of was carelessness. Carelessness. And again, I'm going through these first few quickly, so just sit there. But in Hebrews 3, which is a warning, he says, "Take care, brothers, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart." And the idea is, have you looked at your heart yet? Have you taken care? Some of the translations are, be careful, watch out, beware, see to it. In other words, be careful, not careless. You ever gone past a field where there's thorns and thistles and weeds growing in it? The obvious conclusion is that nobody's really taking care of that field anytime soon. I mean, if somebody took care of the field, the weeds would be out, the thorns would be out, the thistles would be out. I mean, you think of your own garden. If I went to your house and I looked out in the front or looked out in the back and it was just overgrown, the grass wasn't cut, and again, thorns and thistles and weeds were growing, I would have said, what? You've been careless with your garden. Same thing with our hearts. Solomon says, guard your heart, protect your heart, for from it flows all the springs of life. You need to examine your heart to see if there are thorns and thistles growing in your own heart. There might be. There might be some weeds in there. So carelessness could be a cause. And carelessness also comes with not guarding, not just your life, but your doctrine. Maybe you've been listening to some people on the internet. Maybe you've gone through, you think that the YouTube University is going to be teaching you. And you just jump from one false teacher to the next false teacher. That's going to create what? Doubt. That might ultimately lead to unbelief. Watchfulness. Remember I used that term? By the way, the book that I was thinking of, Annabelle reminded me, she looked it up, is by Brian Hedges called Watchfulness. He brings all the Puritans on the subject together under one cover, so you don't have to read all the Puritans. I would encourage you to read that book. I don't know if we know what the art of watchfulness really is. Watching our heart, watching our life, watching our doctrine. Again, the opposite is what? Carelessness. You're just careless. And you can't be. That's how drifting starts. Secondly, idleness. We talked about this. Idleness, sluggishness, laziness. That was King David with Bathsheba. You remember? He was home. He should have been at war. And he was just idle. And idleness will bring on the mischievousness of sin. I mean, you think about it. Seriously, next time you find yourself falling into temptation over some sin, you go back and watch the progress of that, and I bet you can go back to a point where you were just idle and lazy, sluggish. I mean, if you were busy engaging your mind on the things of God, or even in serving the things of God, I don't think there'll be a place of presenting yourself to temptation. But David did that. What's he doing up on the roof watching Bathsheba bathing? Where should he have been? We all get ourselves in trouble because we put ourselves in places that we shouldn't be. We become idle. Drifting. Remember I said? When the writer of Hebrews, the first warning in Hebrews 2 says, pay close attention to what I have. So there's another word to be about watchful, right? Being careful. Pay close attention to what we have heard, lest what? We drift away. And remember what I've said. I've said this a number of times. I said it last week, so it doesn't hurt to say it again. Every time somebody starts drifting, it's because they did what? Nothing. That's how you drift. You drift because you're not doing a thing. Carelessness, idleness. Number 3, shallowness. Shallowness. Listen, when faith has no root, obviously there are no convictions. And then, listen, when faith has no root and you have real no convictions because of no root, and then trouble comes, trials come, guess what? You're lifted up and just tossed and torn by every wave and wind of doctrine. There was a shallowness. There's no root there. Nothing to hold you down. I mean, all the exhortations to hold fast, what are you holding to? There's nothing to hold to. And Jesus explains this in the parable of the sower. He says, those seed on the rocky soil are those who, when they hear, receive the word with joy. And these have no firm root. They believe for a while, and in times of temptation, apostatize. They fall away. They have no firm root. Shallowness. John Bunyan also describes it well in Pilgrim's Progress. Did I tell you this? Listen to Christian's dialogue with Hopeful. This is so insightful on this whole subject. He says, though the consciousness of such men are awakened. So there's an immediate joy. There's a consciousness that's awakened, yet their minds are not changed. I thought that was an interesting observation. The minds are not changed. Therefore, when the power of guilt weareth away, that which provoked them to be religious ceases. Wherefore they naturally turn to their own course again. Thus I say, being hot for heaven by virtue only of the sense and fear of the torments of hell, as their sense and fear of damnation chills and cools, so their desires for heaven and salvation cool also. So then it comes to pass that when their guilt and fear is gone, their desires for heaven and happiness die, and they return to course again. It was just temporary. That's what he's saying. I mean, you've talked to people, I'm sure, evangelized people who say, yes, 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 yes. I mean, the thought of hell? No, I don't want to go to hell. Oh, is Jesus the only way? Sure. A week later, where do you find them? Right back where they were. It was just temporary. It's shallowness. Number 4, again, we're just talking about the phenomenon of apostasy. Where does it all begin? Here's a real one, worldliness. Worldliness. Some of the men, as you know, are reading Mark Jones's book on the Pilgrim's Regress. That's the title of the book, discussing this subject. And in his book, he has a section on the love of the world as a source of backsliding and apostasy. And he quotes Octavius Winslow, who perceptively puts his finger on the coldness of love to Christ versus the hotness of love to the world. And this is what Winslow said. He said, no two affections can be more opposite and antagonists than love to God and love to the world. It is impossible that they can both exist with equal force in the same breast. The one or the other must be supreme. They cannot occupy the same throne, end quote. You know, as parents, I can see that in my kids. I can see this in other kids. I can see that they love the world and the world loves them, and there's a real pull there. This goes for everybody. The love of the world, you came out of the world, but there's still a lingering. The flesh has a lingering love for the world. And it's pulling you. It's pulling you. That's why you need to understand that the two cannot exist in the heart. Remember Demas. I mentioned him earlier. Demas having what? Loved this present world has deserted us, Paul says. Can I say, a love for the world at the end of the day is just a love for what? Sin. A love for the world is just another way of saying you just love your sin. Which is why it's so important that as Christians, you understand what the love of the world means and how you must be mortifying that love. Paul, a couple times, Romans 8:13 and Colossians 3 says, put to death the deeds of the flesh, mortify sin. The Puritans called it mortification. Many Christians don't understand that. They don't understand how to mortify flesh. They don't even know probably that they're supposed to mortify the sin in them. John Owen, who wrote a wonderful book on the subject, said, "You better be killing sin or sin will be killing you." Or as one author put it, when you become so blind that the maker of galaxies and ruler of nations and knower of all mysteries and lover of our souls becomes boring, then only one thing is left, the love of the world. For the heart is always restless and must have its treasure, if not in heaven, then on earth. Did you catch that? That's quite insightful. Your heart's restless. Where's it going to rest in? Love for God or love for the world? I mean, remember what John says in 1 John 2, "Do not love the world nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes and the boastful pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away and also its lust. But the one who does the will of God abides forever." In other words, you don't walk away. Worldliness. Number 5, how about covetousness? I can see people starting to drift and ultimately apostatize when it comes to this, covetousness. I mean, if worldliness is a love for sin, then you can say covetousness is a love for things, right? Same thing with worldliness. A love for things can't coexist with a love for God. A love for the world can't coexist with a love for God. What did Jesus say? You can't serve two masters. You can't be a slave of two masters. You've got to choose. Draw the line. Now, you might have two jobs, so in one sense you have two bosses, but that's not the point. The point spiritually is you're subjecting yourself to the kingship and the lordship of just one. And covetousness comes in and it pulls you away. I mean, you go back to the story of David. What led him to adultery? Well, it was covetousness. I mean, you ever wonder why thou shalt not covet is the 10th commandment? Because it kind of sums up why you did all the other 8 or 9. Why did you commit adultery? Because you coveted. Why did you steal? Because you coveted. Why did you kill? Because you coveted. Covetousness. I don't think we realize how strong of a pull that is on us. What did Paul say in 1 Timothy 6:10? For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and by some longing for it, coveting for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs and griefs. You know, I was reading the Sermon on the Mount again this week, and I want you to listen to this because it's familiar territory, but I want to see if I can put it in a new light for you. When Jesus says, if your right eye makes you stumble, do you know what the Greek word for stumble is there? When your right eye makes you sin, the word is scandalizo, where we get our word what? Scandal. You could literally translate it this way. If your right eye makes you or causes you to what? Fall away. If your right eye makes you to almost apostatize, then do what? Pluck it out. Your right hand causes you to fall away. Cut it off. This is how serious the Lord is. He's threatening. He's talking to Christians here. He's threatening us. Don't fall away. And if your right hand causes you, if you're coveting with your eye, then pluck it out. Now, I don't think he's saying it literally. He's just making a point that you may do some serious spiritual surgery in your life to make sure that you're not backsliding nor apostatizing. If you find yourself complaining and murmuring more than being gratitude, I would say that you are a covetous person. And unchecked, not plucking out, not cutting it off. In fact, can I finish the verse? He says, if you don't cut it off and throw it away for from you, it is better for you to lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go where? Because that's what will happen if you ultimately apostatize. You'll go to hell. So covetousness. Number 6, we got to hustle here. Selfishness. Selfishness. Pride, arrogance, wanting this, wanting that, I. That's going to lead to backsliding, if not apostasy. What's behind selfishness? As I said, it's arrogance, it's pride. We're not getting your way. When you're getting angry, thinking that people should, you deserve more than what people are giving you. Remember in that little series we did on anger? Why are you angry? Why are you angry? Remember God said to Cain, why is your countenance fallen? Why are you angry? At the end of the day, it's because you didn't get what you thought you deserved. Now, it might have been real, it might have been perception, but it's all about you. If you don't start denying yourself, which is what we're called to do, and you start lifting yourself up and you start getting, quote unquote, hurt for every time somebody doesn't do something to you, then you're going to lead it on a path where at best it's backsliding, but as we've seen throughout history, it becomes apostasy. Here's another dialogue between Bunyan and Christian describing apostates in Pilgrim's Progress. He says this: they, the apostates, are full of pride, unwilling to face the worldward shame that comes with the gospel. The shame that attends religion lies also as a block in their way. They are proud and haughty, and religion in their eye is low and contemptible. Therefore, when they have lost their sense of hell and the wrath to come, they return again to their former course. Selfishness. Number 7. On the heels of that, not just selfishness, but self-righteousness. Another way to say this is prayerlessness. I mean, you're looking for catalysts of someone who starts drifting, who ultimately apostatizes. One of the first things that they stop doing is going to church, reading their Bible, and they stop praying. I mean, this is the epitome of unbelief. They just, why wouldn't you pray? Well, because there's no need to pray. Well, why is there no need to pray? Because I can do all it myself. I mean, I don't need to lean on anybody. I don't need to lean on God. I don't need his help in all the things in my life. I can do it. Self-righteousness. I can work my way to heaven. Me, my way, my works, my boasting. When you start having that kind of thinking, you're on your way to apostasy. Bitterness, number 8. Bitterness. Are you in Hebrews 10? Just go over 2 chapters to chapter 12, verse 15. Hebrews 12:15. He says there, see to it that no one comes short of the grace of God. And here it is, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled. I've been around quite a while, and I've seen a number of people walk out the door. I've seen a number of people, not just in this church, but other churches that have apostatized. And at the top of the list, let's say in the top 3, one of the reasons is bitterness. Bitterness. They were offended. They became disappointed. They were disillusioned. And then ultimately they just disappeared. Why? Because there was no forgiveness. There was no reconciliation. And there was just a heart full of resentment and bitterness. And they just took it with them. A hardened bitterness. You wonder why there's so much emphasis in the New Testament on the importance of unity and the quickness to forgive one another. Jesus says, go quickly. Reconcile. If you know someone has a brother has something against you, you go. And I love that. Go quickly. Don't even bring your offering to the altar. Just go and get it sorted out first and foremost. Bitterness and unforgiveness is like gangrene. It breeds suspicion with everyone, and it just separates everybody. You know what I'm talking about. It happens in a family, happens in a marriage, it happens in a church. Listen, marriages dissolve ultimately because bitterness reigned in the heart rather than forgiveness. It's the same with the relationship with God. You've got hardened bitterness for whatever reason. Maybe you're angry with God. That's why we spent a couple weeks talking about that. You can complain to God, but you can't complain about God. But if you don't like the way that God's laid out his plan for your life, maybe you're tired of being single, maybe you're tired of being childless, maybe you've gone from one broken relationship to the next broken relationship. You think you deserve something better? Maybe we need to go back to the Beatitudes of blessed are those who are what? Poor in spirit. There's nothing we brought to Christ, nothing we deserve. But if bitterness is there, resentment is there for whatever reason, it's going to stop a lot of progress. It's going to make you, at best, pause, but probably at worst, digress. So bitterness. Number 9. Just a couple more here. Forgetfulness. Or you could say foolishness. It's one and the same. If you're forgetful, you're probably foolish. And this is really the message of the book of Hebrews in a sense. Here they know the truth. They know all that they've been taught about Christ, but because of the persecution, because of the pressure in the family, they're retreating back to Judaism, which is foolish. But in their foolishness, they forgot. And this is why the letter comes. It's reminding them. You know, I remember thinking way back when, here's Moses. He goes down by God's appointing. He goes down to Egypt. He brings the people out of Egypt. And, you know, that generation that came out of Egypt, they never got to the promised land, did they? They all died in the wilderness. And I thought, well, okay, the second generation's coming, and they're going to get to cross the Jordan to the promised land. What's the message to them? Because you don't want them to act like their fathers, right? So what is Moses going to say to that generation before they go over? Well, it's interesting. If you go through the book of Deuteronomy, which is the message that Moses gives them, I can't remember off the top of my head how many times I counted, but it was this. Remember, remember, remember. Or don't forget, don't forget, don't forget. That was the message. Because that first generation forgot. Proverbs 28:28 says, he who trusts in his own heart is a fool, but he who walks wisely will be delivered. Remembering is being wise. Don't forget. Don't be a fool. Jeremiah 4:22 says this, for my people are ignorant fools. They know me not. They are simple-minded children. They have no understanding. They are wise to do evil, but to do good they do not know. Hosea talks about how God's saying, my people, they have hearts that always go astray. My people always go astray. This is us. We always forget. And in forgetting, we are a fool. We got to remember. Fearfulness, number 10. I get this one. One reason why some might apostatize is because of the fear of man. No one likes to be persecuted. No one likes to be canceled, quote unquote. No one wants to mob after them. I get that, but then we come back to, well, what is your hope in? What are you holding to? The worst thing that could happen is the best thing that could happen. So they send you to the lions. They burn you at the stake. This world's not your home anyway. Proverbs 29:25, the fear of man brings a snare, but he who trusts in the Lord will be exalted. Do you hear all these verses? In the sense that the emphasis is on just trust God, trust God, trust God, trust God, trust God. Remember, we walk by faith, not by what? Sight. Nor by feelings, by the way. Which brings us to point number 11. Here's a real catalyst for backsliding / apostasy, and that's depression. Depression, or maybe better called emotionalism. I was reading a book recently by Alec Ryrie. He's a historian, British historian at Durham University, and he wrote a book called Unbelievers, An Emotional History. And one of the things in his research came up with is that reasons for abandoning the faith came years after years before feeling like they didn't believe. In other words, they just emotionally did not connect, so to speak, or felt like they were a Christian, but then came up with reasons why not to believe a bit later. And I kind of understand that. Because, she has years of not liking the guy before coming up with reasons for walking out on him, right? There's years of attachment of someone before you come up with legitimate reasons for walking out. And I think he hit something here that was absolutely right. He says, it is not necessarily ideas that are motivating energy for doubt and unbelief, but rather feeling and emotions. See, he puts it this way, quote, intellectuals and philosophers may think they make the weather, but they are more often driven by it, end quote. So, yeah, they disbelieve intellectually at the moment, but it was because they had already done so emotionally. And it gives you a lot of examples, like when we come to the age of reasons and all the empirical, rational reasons for not believing. He says when you look at those people that made up all those reasons, they had not believed, they were once part of the church, but they had not believed for years on an emotional level. So you come back to somebody who is depressed. How did they get to that point? I came up with a little scenario some years ago, and I've shared this with you. But the scenario is that we live in this world. This world is full of trouble. And we get disappointed, all right? These are all D's, by the way, to help us remember. You get disappointed. And disappointed, you may then be discouraged. And if you don't fight that, fighting it in the sense that, look, my life is in God's hands. God is providential. All things come from him. So I have to accept whatever he brings. But if you don't work through that and accept that, that can lead to despondency. And despondency is a state where you're just kind of in no man's land. You don't feel like doing a thing. But you have to do things because you have duties and responsibilities. So you do go to work, but you go to work begrudgingly. But if you don't fight despondency, then it does move to what? Depression. And if you don't fight it at that depression level, what does that lead then to? Despair. And despair is the perfection of unbelief. You got that? Despair is the perfection of unbelief. You get somebody in the context of despair where there is no hope. I mean, at despair is where you get suicidal, right? But you trace it all the way back to depression. Someone who's depressed. And maybe we need to define depression real quick so we know what we're talking about. Depression is not to be confused with the seriousness that characterizes the Christian. Depression is not also to be confused with a sorrow for sin. I mean, that's the second beatitude. Blessed are those who are sorrowful. Depression is not to be confused with the occasional trials that come into our lives that result in a momentary or temporary shrinking back. We've all been there. We've all been kicked in the gut, as it were, through our trials, and naturally we keel over and we want to sit on the sideline for a while. But if you're a true Christian, you'll get back in the game, to use the metaphor. That's temporary. Temporary, or you could say momentary shrinking back is not necessarily depression. Depression is something that's persistent, that's immoderate, that's paralyzing, it's self-deprecating and destructive, also, as I said, leading to despair. But someone that is depressed, a Christian, can be depressed, no doubt. But left unchecked, it can turn to unbelief, and unbelief turns to apostasy. And that's my point. Again, we're just looking at certain things that trigger somebody that moves from a steadfastness to a backsliding to ultimately to an apostasy. So there you go. It could be more than 11, but I think there's enough there to ask ourselves, one, am I in any of those? And if I'm not, do I know of anybody in those? And how can I come alongside and help somebody? Someone that's careless and idle and shallow and worldly and covetous and selfish and self-righteous and bitter and foolish and fearful or depressed. And you say, well, what is the remedy, Todd? Obviously, apostatizing, it's a terrifying thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And I don't want my son, I don't want my spouse, I don't want my friend who once said they were a Christian to end up there. So what do I do? Am I my brother's keeper? And I would say, absolutely you are. And you do exactly what the writer of Hebrews is doing, and that's what? You just point him to Christ. You got to remind him that there is no other name given to men under heaven by which we may be saved. You can't put your life in your own hands. Look to Christ. Consider Christ. Give him, again, the glory of Christ, the supremacy of Christ. That's why I love the book of Hebrews. It's a paradigm how to come alongside and help people. It's like a biblical counseling manual. There's only, at the end of the day, really, there's only one person to lead you or anyone out of their spiritual laziness, spiritual apathy, spiritual sluggishness every single time, and that's Jesus Christ. He's the only one, so look to him, cry out to him. I finished last week with a quote by William Gurnall. I want to finish it again because this is another warning. He says, none sink so far into hell as those that come nearest to heaven, because they fall from the greatest height. This is a warning to all of us. The shock of shocks, the tragedy of tragedies, is to think we're going to heaven only to get to the gates of heaven and be thrown into the pit of hell. Don't deceive yourself. Don't be deceived. Self-examine yourself. And the Lord's Supper is a good time to do that. So let's bow in a word of prayer. Father, we just ask that the Spirit of God would be helping us now as we discern ourselves. We don't want to deceive ourselves. There's a number of references in the Bible that tell us that we need to examine ourselves to see if we are in the faith. And what a great time to do that as we take the Lord's Supper, because we have to be in the faith to take it. This is the Lord's table, and we have to be in the Lord. And so may each one of us, in the quietness of our hearts, examine ourselves. Maybe we aren't in any position of apostatizing, but we certainly might be in a position of backsliding. And even that is not where we want to be. We want to be progressing forward, not digressing. And so if we find ourselves a bit spiritually sluggish, spiritually apathetic, Lord, that you would awaken us. May these warnings, and this warning in particular, awaken us. Lord, that we can't be drifting. We need to be exercising those means that you've given us, not just for the progression of our Christian life, but for our usefulness. We want to be useful to you. We want to be those clean vessels that you can use in the advancement of your kingdom. We think of all the ministries we have. We think of the evangelism opportunities, even in our own home, if not at work. You don't want to hide our light under a bushel. Father, you saved us not to be apathetic. Help us not to be. If we can get the men to come wait on you for the Lord's Supper.